Thank you. Very few of you will recognise me, which is regrettable, because as we know, recognition is not entitled. My anonymity is partly functional working for Sky News for 25 years. Sky News has very few viewers. It has enormous influence. When people find out how many viewers they have, they're surprised. It's far fewer than people expect. But they are disproportionately influential because they're watched by MPs, by peers, by other newsrooms, by NGOs, by charities, and to a very great degree, rolling news channels, Sky News being one of them, mainstream media, but rolling news channels especially, with this disproportionate influence. They very much shape the overall video. Sky News sets a tone. I'm going to focus on Sky News, which may seem a bit disloyal, but I know where I speak, so that's what I'm going to do. The tone from Sky has changed, and I think it's worth looking at why that's happened and how that's happened. Last year, I saw a tweet from Andrew Neil, a former colleague, who was criticising Sky, where he worked originally, post-Sunday Times, and he was criticising Sky for their coverage of the Palestine-Israel conflict. I retweeted what he said and added a flourish of my own by saying that I felt that Sky increasingly embraced activism rather than journalism, and that I think the exact quote was that it had become the paraculture wing of Channel 4 News. I'm glad you laughed, because that was not the reaction of a senior Sky executive who was working on WhatsApp asking me to justify what I said. Now, I'll say to you what I said to him. Because the change at Sky, and this comes to control of the narrative, the change at Sky is partly top-down, it's partly bottom-up. Some examples of it being top-down. There was a programme, some of you may remember it was utterly execrable on Sky, called the Climate Change Show, and every day it possessed no journalistic imperative whatsoever, and it was essentially greenwashing by a company which felt deeply embarrassed about its Murdoch origin story and wanted to wash the group right out of his hair. It was about controlling a narrative as well as the corporate instinct to greenwash. Then 2020, the Black Lives Matter coverage of Sky, which at times was borderline hysterical in my opinion, and led to actual substantive measures being taken for employees, including unconscious bias courses. To my shame, I submitted to one, and this would be a familiar story to many of you. I was recently widowed, I had young children. I was desperate not to do that unconscious bias course, but like many of you, you submit, don't you? Because you don't really cancel all that entails. Around at the same time, there was an inclusive language guide, which wasn't directed specifically at journalists, but it definitely had a chilling effect on journalists, advocating certain types of language over others. I was not the only presenter at Sky News who lived in fear of the juggernaut coming towards us marked pronoun, and whether you would say a certain word or avoid a certain word. It's an existential question. So that was the sort of top-down pressure to control the narrative. There was this bottom-up pressure as well. It's a bit like what's been happening in some publishing houses where junior members of staff decide who's published and what's published. One example, which I think tells you a lot. One Thursday, I was covering for somebody else's shift. Thursdays during lockdown, we were applauding for the NHS. A producer called me and said, at 8 o'clock we want you to get up from your desk, go across the studio, stand by the news wall, we'll take live shots of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer applauding or banging their pots and pans, and you'll do the same. And I refused to do it. I said that I didn't stand up and applaud for the last group of heroes who arrived back in Britain in coffins from Afghanistan and back. I'm not going to do it for this group of heroes, because in 3 years or 5 years, there may be heroes no more when the journalistic wheel of fate turns off a screw, and then where will our journalistic integrity be? That was an example of activism, I think, very much over journalistic principle. But it was also an event. There was a process I draw your attention to as well. It particularly relates to, I mentioned in the introduction, particularly relates to the coverage of Sky, not just Sky, other rolling news channels, more small, or mainstream media more broadly, of terrorist atrocities. Post 9/11, there was a freewheeling attitude, there was a willingness to interrogate robustly ideologies. I remember interviewing Anjum Chowdhury, more lately, I guess, His Majesty. It was a very open time. That slowly dissipated. I stood on the police tape, Manchester, London, Glasgow, abroad, Madrid, Nairobi, etc., etc., etc. And I saw the move towards don't look back in anger, I saw Sky and others become effectively organs of reassurance, peddlers of a comforting narrative. And I still wonder at that, and I wonder what we've lost because that's happened. I know we haven't got long. I'll just say a couple more points. One is an event which was a clarifying moment for me. It was actually two events rolled into one. The migration crisis of 2015. There was no guiding hand or guiding mind of the coverage of journalists on the ground in those Eastern European countries. But there was an incuriosity and there was a deep want of scepticism, and that fed into a corrosion in trust for mainstream media, which I think then fed directly into the events of next year, the Brexit vote. The Brexit vote, by the way, I remember on 7 occasions, the morning after by-elections, when the turnout had been pretty poor, and we were lamenting voter apathy, what can we do to re-engage people, and then when people were re-engaging, energised by politics and the run to the Brexit vote, we ran our hands. What was in my ears? I should wind up. Okay. There were tears in the Sky newsroom the morning of the Brexit vote, but they just discovered the wrong kind of engagement. Why has this happened? Two reasons. One you've been familiar with, as we've seen a shift away from a profession, from a trade to a profession. The journalists have become anywhere rather than somewhere, no longer hefty to the community. The second reason comes with this one, is I think it's a genuine insight, potentially, and that is that, I'll come back to my original point, the number of people watching from Sky tiny. As customers have left mainstream media, a different metric applies, and that is no longer customers, it's awards. And the effect of that is that when you're conducting an interview, you're not looking to the customer, the viewer, the listener, or the reader, you are looking to your newsroom colleagues and peers, and it's their approval, not the customers, that you seek. Thank you very much.